Lake Superior, Lake Superior. That's our, in my opinion, the way I see it, that's our garden. Me and Talon, we were on the front page of USA Today, that newspaper. And that was 10 years ago, 2007. And part of that was the mercury. They're doing a mercury pollution type study across the nation, and that's one of the things that changed our lives when we gather now. We adopt the different methods, and what's changed our life. There's some lakes that we fish on. You can't even eat fish, and you can't even eat. You would not even want to feed the fish to your kids because of the mercury that's in the lake. In fact, you wouldn't even. They say you wouldn't want to even feed a woman who's pregnant. So there's all these different lakes now that have different mercury levels on it, that we go spearing on. In fact, even Lake Superior has is probably less harmful because it's a big body of water than the inland lakes. There's smaller. So there's some places that I won't even go catch the fish. And that was, 10, 15 years ago. Went to one lake up there by Solon Springs, caught some fish there, and I put the light on there and looked at the walleye, and they were just faded. They didn't even have no color hardly. They were just faded, faded. Something wrong with that fish. They didn't look right, different. So I didn't eat them. But there's another treaty over here, the unwritten law. The unwritten law that we've gotten away from. Everybody. We've gotten away from that unwritten law. For an example, you got 20 fish in that, 20 fish down there. You're gonna take all that fish, or you're gonna leave some fish in there so they can reproduce for the future generations down the road. Or when you go in the woods, and do I take all the birds in that one spot? No, you leave some. So there's a reverence and respect, not just the Shinabe who have treaties, but there's a reverence and respect that the human race has to the earth. And we've gotten away from that.
And when I'm fishing and doing other sorts of stuff, kind of clears my mind. It's very spiritual, and if you do it in the right way.
So that frog then will tell you when it's time to go spearing. Or there's different things you kind of watch out for with the leaves, with the if you wanna, the suckers spawn when them papa leaves are about big as a squirrel ear, they'll say. So when that leaf in the springtime, that leaf is big as a squirrel ear, don't set your nets then, unless you want to catch 1,000 suckers. Or the temperature in the water, Mille Lacs, for an example. Mille Lacs today now, Mille Lacs Lake is suffering. And walleye are dying. They're dying in that lake. So when the water temperature in the springtime reaches a certain temperature, that's when all them walleye will spawn in the springtime. That's when they'll spawn. They'll spawn here too. But I remember having a hard time trying to find the fish, trying to find the lake, trying to find the fish because their environment changed. So where they went out deeper in the lake where it was cooler. The temperature of the water was different. So even the climate even changed the patterns of the animals, of the fish. It was different. But I noticed something. I noticed when the water was warming up because of the climate, because the climate was different. I noticed we were catching bass. Holy crap, we catching great big bass. Where are the big bass? I never used to catch that many bass. So I think they came from, my guess, they came from Schwamigan Bay. Schwamigan Bay is shallower water, and the water was warmer, and they come going this way, and the other fish went out. They went out. So I often thought, since that experience, I often thought if we had a tremendous climate change, what would happen to Lake Superior? And I seen it, what's going to happen. I seen that summer what's going to happen. There's going to be more bass and more. I mean, there might even, and I think if Lake Superior warms up any more than it does, you're going to start seeing a big decline in trout, a big decline in different species of fish, and you're probably going to see more bass, and this will probably be the biggest walleye lake in the world. So can we eat? Do I feel bad the lake is changing? Yeah, I do. Just like Talon talked about, and he's right. He's right what he talked about. The it's going to change things, how we are. It's going to change our culture.
We live on Gitchigumi, the largest body of fresh water in the world by surface. It's something that we chose to live here. Our ancestors brought us here to live. There's a story behind that. But one of the facts is we could get fish out of Lake Superior to feed our members. So there's a big drastic thing in the winters come around here, which then affects, of course, the patterns in the lakes, in the fish. It affects the patterns of the natural resources around here, which really affects our methodology of harvest and our time frame of harvest. Some of the other things that we have around here is your commercial fishing. We were very dependent on commercial fishing up here for a livelihood, and the seasonal change of that. I've been told that Lake Superior on average has increased by 2 degrees, the water temperature itself. Now, I listen to some of our commercial fishermen who have books from their grandparents when they fished and where they fished, and they're routinely almost 2 weeks to a month off comparative to times when they set. So they look in their little black book and it says, we should be over here July 1st. There's good whitefish here July 1st. Well, now they go and set there July 1st. There's not good whitefish there. It may be July 14th or the end of July before the good whitefish show back up. And that has a cycle that has occurred, so it's changed. Of course, we know that everything runs in cycles, but the trend seems to be really off compared to what was talked about, what was written down for the commercial fishing aspect of things. Because in the permit concept in the close of the seasons is we have certain closed seasons to protect the lake trout, which is a key element in Lake Superior, although our target species that we're trying to get is whitefish. But we're trying to protect the lake trout. And it's set up so that the close is supposed to cover the span of the spawning seasons for lake trout. Now, when things start getting shifted by a week or 2 weeks or a month, are we still protecting those? So seasonal changes are occurring, and with the fish, it is really occurring out there. In the season and the permits that we have out there for seasons now, do they do what they were intended to do back in the day? Well, they still cover that, but we're modifying things as we go along so that we ensure that those species that we're protecting for certain time frames are still protected. But that's one of the things that are out there that we're doing just because trends are changing. I'm dependent on other home use fishermen for my home use fish, and it's activity that I have to regulate, so just as soon not do it. And I have relatives that do, and if I want fish, I just ask. and they'll give it to me. So, but we have some big families around here that depended upon that for most of their fish for the year. They go out and they harvest it, and they're usually in the spring and the fall are the best times. And then you got the concept of the rain and the snow. You know, when I was a kid, all these creeks around here had rainbow trout running up them because the water levels were high enough to allow the fish to come up the creeks. Recently, the water level in the creeks, because of lack of snow, lack of rain, they're not high enough to have the bigger fish come up to spawn. So are we losing generations of fish that came up to spawn in these creeks around here? Well, you know, some of our lakes have turning over to more beneficial to bass for inland waters versus walleye. So those things are going to happen. So you had a lake that was good for walleye fishing. It's still okay for walleye fishing, but it become a much better bass fisheries. Well, your trend was to eat walleye and harvest more walleye. So now your trend is either you have to switch over to bass or some other fish if that's available, or, you know, and when you're changing foods, it doesn't come easy. That's not your traditional food that you ate in the past.
My research focuses a lot on climate change effects on fish populations in inland lakes, as well as other stressors on fish populations, such as invasive species and land use change and stuff like that. We were really interested in understanding declines that were already observed in walleye in Wisconsin lakes and the simultaneous increase of largemouth bass at the same time. So initially my research focused on that, of understanding what was happening right now and what had already happened and the drivers of that. And that kind of led us into projections of climate change. So our early work trying to understand walleye declines in Wisconsin showed that most of the declines could be traced to recruitment failures. So failures of walleye to survive through their first summer and into their first fall. In places where they used to do that, they weren't doing it as often anymore. So we tried to understand lake characteristics that were associated with good walleye recruitment versus not so good. And one of the major ones that we found was that water temperature was a good predictor of walleye recruitment success. So lakes that were warmer were less likely to support walleye recruitment. Lakes that were cooler were more likely to support walleye recruitment, with some exceptions. So we found that in big lakes, in Wisconsin's biggest lakes, or the ceded territory's biggest lakes, even if they were warm, walleye did okay. So it was more in the smaller lakes that they seemed really sensitive to water temperature. So that was kind of understanding the current situation. And then I worked with a number of collaborators to develop some projections for how might water temperatures for Wisconsin lakes change into the future, and what might that mean for recruitment. And we found, probably not surprisingly, given what I said, that warmer lakes are less likely to support walleye recruitment. Under scenarios of climate change, as lakes get warmer, they're less and less likely to support walleye recruitment, and conversely, more and more likely to support high abundances of largemouth bass. But again, the lake size effect holds into the future. So the biggest lakes seem to be most resilient, that even as they warm, they're predicted to still be okay for walleye. I have a new research project starting up that will look at that a little bit in Minnesota lakes, lakes that are invaded by zebra mussels and spiny water flea that are really disrupting the food web, as well as, in the case of zebra mussels, changing water clarity, which can really change the temperature dynamics of lakes. We're looking into that and how they might interact with climate change. But the lakes that we predict that are going to be most resilient to climate change, or we think are going to be most resilient to climate change, are generally the places that walleye are native to. So big rivers, big lakes, flowages. These are places that walleye seem to be able to handle warming a bit better than really small inland isolated lakes where walleye were stocked over the past 100 years and did pretty well in a lot of cases for a while when climate conditions were right, and maybe conditions just aren't right for those places anymore. Well, and generally the lakes that are speared by The tribes are those really good, large, big producer lakes, the most resilient ones. So that's good news. I know that Superior is warming faster than any lake in the world, and that's certainly going to have effects on the fish community. One of the main theories for Superior is that it's an ice cover effect. So a positive feedback of as there's less and less ice cover, it receives more sunlight and warms more, and then there's less ice cover and then it warms more. And Superior doesn't have a ton of oxygen issues, so that squeeze usually is because the cold bottom waters don't have oxygen and the oxygenated waters on top are too warm, and then things get squished out. Superior is generally pretty well oxygenated, but